Everyone, the British are coming. Hello, everyone. This is Russell Rucker, and I'm here for another constitutional talk. And today I thought we'd get into our original beginning of our conflict. And I feel it necessary to kind of paint a story, and paint the picture, you would say, of what was really going on. Boston was infiltrated with a tremendous amount of military from England. In fact, they had about a quarter of the population encamped. One of the great areas they were camped outside of outbuildings and homes and everywhere they could find barns, that kind of thing, was on the Boston Commons. The Boston Commons is more than just some big park. It actually has a function. So all throughout New England, you have these commons in virtually every town and village. And the purpose is for have a place for horses, cows, livestock to graze. So it actually had a function. The other thing it was used for in a lot of your smaller towns was for the militia to practice, militia and Minutemen. And so all this was a function. Now out in Lexington, on the green that we're going to be talking about, they had basically 3 or 4 houses, and they had the Buckhorn Tavern there. And this is just kind of the layout. Now, as you go through the countryside, you'll find stone walls lining between property lines and all along the road out of Boston. And the reason this is there is because when they leveled the trees to plant crops and they started turning up the ground, it's so rocky out there that you have a lot of stone. So they just stacked them on their property line, and it created a lot of stone walls. It was kind of a natural thing. And there weren't as many trees as you find today because they'd taken the trees down in order to plant. So there really wasn't a lot of things to hide behind. They had some trees, they had stone walls, and this kind of thing. Now the British marches out of Boston and goes up the Boston Road, and Paul Revere and Dow's and their famous ride, they go out and they're warning people, bells are ringing. Now, not just a church bell, gong, gong, gong kind of thing, but a rat-tat-tat-tat-tat-tat kind of a warning, telling people to get up, there was a real problem. And all the way along the road, you had that and warning gunshots and everything else. So there was a great amount of noise going on in the middle of the night. You have to understand exactly what was occurring. So Paul Revere and Dow's, they arrive at Menominee, and they go over to the Black Horse Tavern there. And the Black Horse Tavern is where Generals Orr and Lee are meeting with Mr. Gary. Mr. Gary later would become governor of Massachusetts, and he's known for gerrymandering. Okay? And they're meeting out there, and they're warned by Revere of the British marching out. So they're already warned about this. And when the British did get to the Black Horse Tavern, they hid in the cornfield so they would not be discovered while they searched the area. Now, the troops continued on, and they marched past, and the next town there is Lexington. And John Parker is notified about 1 a.m. He's the head of their militia organization in Lexington. Now you have to understand all this ringing and shooting and everything is bringing out other militia groups, and they're coming in and they're answering their call. Now, the whole idea of these militias, see, every town had a militia. Everyone between 18 and 65, remember, every male was a member of the militia. And the prime reason was to protect themselves against Indian attack. So they would get together immediately and come out of their homes, the Minutemen and the militias, and they would come out and they would gather for the defense of the countryside against Indian attacks. So this was a real important system that they had. So they were well armed, and they were proud of the accuracy of their shots. That these were real marksmen. They practiced this. They had contests on who was the best marksman. These were people that had really worked at being the best shot. Not only were they protecting themselves from Indians, but they needed for hunting, for deer, turkey, all kinds of different game that they were trying to bring back. So all of this was in play at that time. Like about 1 a.m., John Parker is notified that the British are coming. The British are marching down in their burgundy red uniforms, bayonets on. They're marching down the line. They have a light horse brigade in front of them. And that's the picture that I got to paint for this large marching, basically European army coming down through the rural areas of Massachusetts. Major John Pitcairn is the head of the British Army during this event. And John Parker's notified at 1 a.m., and they gather at the headquarters at the Buckhorn Tavern, just across from their commons, the Lexington Commons. Now, there is a schoolhouse on the Lexington Commons. It's a fairly large section of land. And then you have a few houses surrounding it. It's a very interesting place. There's a Clark house at the one end, and that house is where John Hancock and Samuel Adams are staying. See, they're having government meetings with the British in session in Boston. They're meeting out in western Massachusetts, and so they've got a room at the Clark house. And they're notified, as Paul Revere comes through, and they're notified that, hey, you guys need to disperse and get out of here. So they leave the area and head to the outskirts for a safer place to be if you got all the British marching in. And it gets to be about 2 o'clock, and John Parker has been waiting out for the British to show up, some sign that the British is going to arrive. And he disperses his group of about 200 men. And the reason he does this is it's taking so long. And he tells them to be on alert, and if they're needed, we're gonna call you back. The dawn starts to roll in. And the sun starts to rise from the east, and they are spotted. Thomas Bowman rode in announcing that he'd seen the British Commons. And they're starting, if you can picture this, from where they're at the Buckhorn, they can see the columns start to come in through the morning fog. Remember, this is April. There's snow, there's mud. These soldiers are exhausted from their march. They left Boston about 10 o'clock, and it's tough going through the mud and the muck and the bogs and the swampiness of some of these areas. And So they're getting pretty well exhausted. You've got the light horse brigade in front of them. Then you can see the columns of British soldiers marching behind them. John Parker waiting in the Buckhorn Tavern comes out with his group, and he has William Diamond, a young man, and he orders the assembly called. He's the drummer of their militia, and he gets the assembly together, and they line up at parade rest. The British a few minutes later, come onto the green, and the light horse brigade marches in front of him, and he gives an order, raises his sword, and says, "Lay down and disperse. Lay down your weapons and disperse." And they slowly move off of the green, at which point the soldiers fire into the crowd. Some of them even thought that it was just a threatening, that they weren't loaded. But after some of them fell, they realized the importance, and some were wounded and crawling back to their homes that lined around the green area. The British, moving around, seeing some of them scattering, trying to escape, even shot some of them in their back as they tried to get back. One man dying in the arms of his wife over on the porch. The soldiers are trying to enter buildings and trying to rob silver and anything else they can gain from these farmers. And there's this great turmoil, and that's when Major Pitcairn gets his drummer and orders recall. And only in an ordered recall can he gather his troops back because of all the confusion up on the green. And they march on. You can hear them march off, singing a tune. 50 onlookers scattered around the green, watching what had just occurred and the horror of it all. Following this, they marched off onto the green and down the road towards Concord. And this is really the beginning of this tremendous battle. They buried some of those that died right on the green, and there is a monument across from where they stood today with the graves of these patriots. And where they're buried is primarily where the British stood, and directly across is where the Patriots were stood. They did not believe that there was going to be this battle. Britain had marched out before, and nothing had occurred. But Britain was determined to seize weapon stores that were held in Concord. It was reported that they were held up on Barrett's farm in Concord, and that's what their destination was. But they also had warrants for Samuel Adams and John Hancock. In fact, when Paul Revere came back from his ride, he found John Hancock still at his rented residence, thinking he was going to wait and do something about it. And he convinced him, hey, you got to get out of here because you're a great prize for the British, and you're more valuable to us as a leader than hung or imprisoned. Anyway, this is how the battle begins. This is the battle up on the Lexington Green. And it moves off into Concord later in the day. And all these units coming from all over are constantly hitting the British on their march back. We'll get to that in a later video. I hope you get a little better idea. I hope I've described it well enough so that you can understand exactly what happened that morning. And we'll catch you next time on the next Constitutional Talk. Goodbye for now, folks. Have a good day now. Subscribe to my channel, please, if you haven't. We'll see you next time on the next Constitutional Talk. Goodbye for now.